Chapter 5, in which the narrative of our knight's mishap is continued. Finding then that in fact he could not move, he thought himself of having recourse to his usual remedy, which was to think of some passage in his books, and his craze brought to his mind that about Baldwin and the Marquis of Mantua, when Carlotto left him wounded on the mountainside, a story known by heart by the children, not forgotten by the young men, and lauded and even believed by the old folk, and for all that not a whit truer than the miracles of Mahomet. This seemed to him to fit exactly the case in which he found himself, so, making a show of severe suffering, he began to roll on the ground and with feeble breath repeat the very words which the wounded knight of the wood is said to have uttered. "Where art thou, lady mine, that thou my sorrow dost not rue? Thou canst not know it, lady mine, or else thou art untrue." And so he went on with the ballad as far as the lines, "O noble Marquis of Mantua, my uncle and liege lord." As chance would have it, when he had got to this line, there happened to come by a peasant from his own village, a neighbour of his, who had been with a load of wheat to the mill, and he, seeing the man stretched there, came up to him and asked him who he was, and what was the matter with him that he complained so dolefully. Don Quixote was firmly persuaded that this was the Marquis of Mantua, his uncle, so the only answer he made was to go on with his ballad, in which he told the tale of his misfortune, and of the loves of the emperor's son and his wife, all exactly as the ballad sings it. The peasant stood amazed at hearing such nonsense, and relieving him of the visor, already battered to pieces by blows, he wiped his face, which was covered with dust, and as soon as he had done so, he recognized him and said, "Signor Quixote," for so he appears to have been called when he was in his senses, and had not yet changed from a quiet country gentleman into a knight-errant. "Who has brought your worship to his pass?" But to all questions the other only went on with his ballad. Seeing this, the good man removed as well as he could his breastplate and back-piece to see if he had any wound, but he could perceive no blood nor any mark whatever. He then contrived to raise him from the ground, and with no little difficulty hoisted him upon his ass, which seemed to be the easiest mount for him, and collecting the arms, even to the splinters of the lance, he tied them on Rocinante, and leading them by the bridle and his ass by the halter, he took the road for the village, very, very sad to hear what absurd stuff Don Quixote was talking. Nor was Don Quixote less so, for what with the blows and bruises, he could not sit upright on the ass, and from time to time he sent up sighs to heaven, so that once more he drove the peasant to ask what ailed him, and it could have been only the devil himself that put into his head tales to match his own adventures, for now, forgetting Baldwin, he bethought himself the more Albin de Reyes, when the Alcalde of Antequera, Rodrigo de Narvaez, took him prisoner and carried him away to his castle, so that when the peasant again asked him how he was and what ailed him, he gave him for reply the same words and phrases that the captive Abindarez gave to Rodrigo de Narvaez, just as he had read the story in the Diana of Jorge de Montemayor when it is written, applying it to his own case so aptly that the peasant went along, cursing his fate that he had to listen to such a lot of nonsense, and which, however, he came to the conclusion that his neighbour was mad, and so made all haste to reach the village to escape the wearisomeness of this harangue of Don Quixote's, who at the end of it said, "Signor Don Rodrigo de Narvaez, your worship must know that this fair Zafira I have mentioned is now the lovely Dulcinea del Toboso, for whom I have done, am doing, and will do the most famous deeds of chivalry that this world has ever seen, are to be seen, or ever shall see." To this the peasant answered, "Signor, sinner that I am, cannot your worship see that I am not Don Rodrigo de Narvaez, nor the Marquis of Mantua, but Pedro Alonso, your neighbour, and that your worship is neither Baldwin nor Abindarez, but the worthy gentleman Signor Quixote?" "I know who I am," replied Don Quixote, "and I know that I may not be only those that I named, but all the 12 peers of France, and even the 9 worthies, since my achievements surpass all that they have done altogether, and each of them on his own account." With this talk, and more of the same kind, they reached the village just as night was beginning to fall, but the peasant waited until it was a little later, that the belaboured gentleman might not be seen riding in such a miserable trim. When it was what seemed to him the proper time, he entered the village and went to Don Quixote's house, which he found all in confusion, and there were the curate and the village barber, who were great friends of Don Quixote, and his housekeeper was saying to them in a loud voice, "What does your worship think can have befallen my master, Signor Licentiate Pero Perez?" For the curate was called. "It is 3 days now since anything has been seen of him, or the hack, or the buckler, lance, or armour. Miserable me, I am certain of it, and it is true as that I was born to die, that these accursed books of chivalry he has, and has got into the way of reading so constantly, have upset his reason. For now I remember having heard him saying to himself that he would turn knight-errant and go all over the world in quest of adventures. To the devil and barbarous with such books, that have brought to ruin in this way the finest understanding there was in all La Mancha." The niece said the same and more. "You must know, Master Nicholas," for that was the name of the barber, "it was often my uncle's way to stay 2 days and nights together poring over these unholy books of misventures, after which he would fling the book away and snatch up his sword and fall to slashing the walls, and when he was tired out he would say he had killed 4 giants like 4 towers, and the sweat that flowed from him when he was weary he said was the blood of the wounds he had received in battle, and then he would drink a great jug of cold water and become calm and quiet, saying that this water was a most precious potion which the sage Esquif, a great magician and friend of his, had brought him. But I take all the blame upon myself, and having told your worships of my uncle's vagaries, that you might put a stop to them before things had come to this pass, and burn all these accursed books, for he has a great number, that richly deserve to be burned like heretics." "So say I too," said the curate, "and by my faith tomorrow shall not pass without public judgment upon them, and may they be condemned to the flames, lest they lead those that read to behave as my good friend seems to have behaved." All this the peasant heard, and from it he understood at last what was the matter with his neighbour, so he began calling aloud, "Open, your worships, to Signor Baldwin, and to the Signor the Marquis of Mantua, who comes badly wounded, and to Signor Abindarez the Moor, whom the valiant Rodrigo de Narvaez, the alcayde of Antequera, brings captive." At these words they all hurried out, and when they recognized their friend, master, and uncle, who had not yet dismounted from the ass because he could not, they ran to embrace him. "Hold," said he, "for I am badly wounded through my horse's fault. Carry me to bed, and if possible, send for the wise Urganda to cure and see to my wounds." "See there, plague on it," cried the housekeeper at this. "Did not my heart tell the truth as to which foot my master went lame of? To bed with your worship at once, and we will contrive to cure you here without fetching that Urganda. A curse, I say once more, and 100 times more, on these books of chivalry that have brought your worship to such a pass." They carried him to bed at once, and after searching for his wounds could find none, but he said they were all bruises from having had a severe fall with his horse Rocinante when in combat with 10 giants, the biggest and boldest to be found on earth. So, said the curate, "are there giants in the dance? By the sign of the cross I will burn them tomorrow before the day over." They put a host of questions to Don Quixote, but his only answer to all was give him something to eat and leave him to sleep, for that was what he needed most. They did so, and the curate questioned the peasant at great length as to how he had found Don Quixote. He told him, and the nonsense he had talked when he found and on the way home, all which made the licentiate the more eager to do what he did the next day, which was to summon his friend the barber, Master Nicholas, and go with him to Don Quixote's house. Chapter 6. Of the diverting and important scrutiny which the curate and the barber made in the library of our ingenious gentleman. He was still sleeping, so the curate asked the niece for the keys of the room where the books, the authors of all the mischief, were, and right willingly she gave them. They all went in, the housekeeper with them, and found more than 100 volumes of big books, very well bound, and some other small ones. The moment the housekeeper saw them, she turned and ran out of the room, and came back immediately with a saucer of holy water and a sprinkler, saying, "Here, your worship, Signor Licentiate, sprinkle this room. Don't leave any magician of the many there are in the books to bewitch us in revenge for our design of banishing them from the world." The simplicity of the housekeeper made the licentiate laugh, and he directed the barber to give him the books one by one and see what they were about, as there might be some to be found among them that did not deserve the penalty of fire. "No," said the niece, "there is no reason for showing mercy to any of them. They have every one of them done mischief. Better to fling them out the window into the court, and make a pile of them and set fire to them, or else carry them into the yard, and there a bonfire could be made without the smoke giving any annoyance." The housekeeper said the same, so eager were they both for the slaughter of those innocents, but the curate would not agree to it without first reading, at any rate, the titles. The first that Master Nicholas put his hand on was the 4 books of Amadis of Gaul. "This seems a mysterious thing," said the curate, "for, as I have heard say, this was the first book of chivalry printed in Spain, and from this all the others derive their birth and origin, so it seems to me that we ought inexorably to condemn it to the flames as the founder of so vile a sect." "Nay, sir," said the barber, "I too have heard say that this is the best of all the books of this kind that have been written, and so, as something as singular in its line, it ought to be pardoned." "True," said the curate, "and for that reason let its life be spared for the present. Let us see that other which is next to it." "It is," said the barber, "the Sergus de Esplanadian, the lawful son of Amadis of Gaul." "Then, verily," said the curate, "the merit of the father must not be put down onto the account of the son. Take it, mistress housekeeper, open the window and fling it into the yard, and lay the foundation of the pile for the bonfire we are to make." The housekeeper obeyed with great satisfaction, and the worthy Esplanadian went flying into the yard to await with all patience the fire that was in store for him. "Proceed," said the curate. "This that comes next," said the barber, "is Amadis of Greece, and indeed I believe all those on this side are of the same Amadis lineage." "Then to the yard with the whole of them," said the curate, "for to have a burning of Queen Pintiquiniestra, and the shepherd Daranel with his eclogues, and the bedevilled and involved discourses of this author, I would burn them with the father who begot me, if he were going about in the guise of a knight-errant." "I am of the same mind," said the barber. "And so am I," added the niece. "In that case," said the housekeeper, "here, into the yard with them." They were handed to her, and there were many of them. She spared herself the staircase, and flung them down out of the window. "Who is that tub there?" said the curate. "This," said the barber, "is Don Oliavante de Laura. The author of that book," said the curate, "was the same that wrote The Garden of Flowers, and truly there is no deciding which of the 2 books is the more faithful, or, to put it better, the less lying. All I can say is, send this one into the yard for a swaggering fool." "This that follows is the Floris Marte of Hircania," said the barber. "Senor Floris Marte here?" said the curate. "Then by my faith he must take up his quarters in the yard, in spite of his marvellous birth and visionary adventures, for the stiffness and dryness of his style deserve nothing else. Into the yard with him, and the other, mistress housekeeper." "With all my heart, senor," said she, and executed the order with great delight. "This," said the barber, "is the Knight Plautier." "An old book that," said the curate, "but I find no reason for clemency in it. Send it after the others without appeal." Which was done. Another book was opened, and they saw it was entitled The Knight of the Cross. "For the sake of the holy name this book has," said the curate, "its ignorance might be excused, but then, they say, behind the cross there's the devil. To the fire with it." Taking down another book, the barber said, "This is The Mirror of Chivalry." "I know his worship," said the curate. "That is where the Signor Reyneldos of Montalvan figures with his friends and comrades, greater thieves than Carcass, and the 12 peers of France with the veracious historian Turpin. However, I am not for condemning them for more than perpetual banishment, because, at any rate, they have some share in the invention of the famous Matteo Boiardo, whence too the Christian poet Ludovico Aristoso wove his web, to whom, if I find him here, and speaking any language but his own, I shall show no respect whatever, but if he speaks his own tongue, I will put him upon my head. Well, I have him in Italian, said the barber, but I do not understand him. Nor would it be well that you should understand him, said the curate, and on that score we might have excused the captain if he had not brought him into Spain and turned him into Castilian. He robbed him of a great deal of his natural force, and so do all those who try to turn books written in verse into another language, for with all the pains they take and all the cleverness they show, they can never reach the level of the originals as they were first produced. In short, I say that this book, and all that might be found treating of those French affairs, should be thrown into or deposited in some dry well, until, after more consideration, it is settled what is to be done with them, excepting always one Bernardo del Carpio that is going about, and another called Roncesvalles, for these, if they come into my hands, shall pass at once into those of the housekeeper, and from hers into the fire, without any reprieve. To all this the barber gave his assent, and looked upon it as right and proper, being persuaded that the curate was so staunch to the faith and loyal to the truth that he would not for the world say anything opposed to them. Opening another book, he saw it was Palmerin de Oliva, and beside it was another called Palmerin of England, seeing which the licentiate said, "Let the olive be made of firewood at once, and burned until no ashes even are left, and let that palm of England be kept and preserved as a thing that stands alone. And let such another case be made for it as that which Alexander found among the spoils of Darius, and set aside for safe keeping of the works of the poet Homer. This book, Gossip, is of authority for two reasons. First, because it is very good, and secondly, because it is said to have been written by a wise and witty king of Portugal. All the adventures at the castle of Miraguarda are excellent and of admirable contrivance, and the language is polished and clear, studying and observing the style befitting the speaker with propriety and judgment. So then, provided it seems good to you, Master Nicholas, I say let this and Amadis of Gaul be remitted the penalty of fire, and as for the rest, let them perish without further question or query. Nay, gossip, said the barber, for this that I have here is the famous Don Bellianus. Well, said the curate, that and the second, third, and fourth parts all stand in need of a little rhubarb to purge their excess of bile, and that they must be cleared of all that stuff about the Castle of Fame and other greater affectations, to which end let them be allowed the overseas term, and according as they mend, so shall mercy or justice be meted out to them. And in the meantime, gossip, do you keep them in your house, and let no one read them. With all my heart, said the barber, not caring to tire himself with reading more books of chivalry. He told the housekeeper to take all the big ones and throw them into the yard. It was not said to one dull or deaf, but to one who enjoyed burning them more than weaving the broadest and finest web that could be, and, seizing about 8 at a time, she flung them out the window. In carrying so many together, she let one fall at the feet of the barber, who took it up, curious to know whose it was, and found it said, History of the famous knight Tirante el Blanco. God bless me, said the curate with a shout. Tirante el Blanco here. Hand it over, gossip, for in it I reckon I have found a treasury of enjoyment and a mine of recreation. Here is Don Creolesian of Montalvan, a valiant knight, and his brother Thomas of Montalvan, with the knight Fonseca, and with the battle the bold Tirante fought with the mastiff, and the witticisms of the damsel Placiderma and the loves and wiles of the widow Reposada, and the empress in love with the squire Hippolito. In truth, gossip, by right of its style, it is the best book in the world. Here knights eat and sleep, and die in their beds, and make their wills before dying, and a great deal more of which there is nothing in all the other books. Nevertheless, I say, he who wrote it, for deliberately composing such fooleries, deserves to be sent to the galleys for life. Take it home with you and read it, and you will see that what I have said is true. As you will, said the barber, but what are we to do with these little books that are left? These must be not chivalry, but poetry, said the curate. and opening one he saw it was the Diana of Jorge de Montemayor, and supposing that all the others be of the same sort, these, he said, do not deserve to be burned like the others, for they neither do nor can do the mischief the books of chivalry have done, being books of entertainment that can hurt no one. Ah, senor, said the niece, your worship had better order these to be burnt as well as the others, for it would be no wonder if, after being cured of his chivalry disorder, my uncle, by reading these, took a fancy to turn shepherd and range the woods and fields, singing and piping, or what would be still worse, to turn poet, which they say is an incurable and infectious malady. The damsel is right, said the curate, and it will be well to put this stumbling block and temptation out of our friend's way. To begin, then, with the Diana of Montemayor. I am of the opinion it should not be burned, but that it should be cleared of all that about the sage Felicia and the magic water, and of almost all the longer pieces of verse. Let it keep and welcome its prose, and the honour of being the first of books of the kind. This that comes next, said the barber, is the Diana, entitled the second part by the Salamancan, and this other has the same title, and its author is Gil Polo. As for that of the Salamancan, replied the curate, let it go to swell the number of condemned in the yard, and let Gil Polo's be preserved, as it came from Apollo himself. But get on, gossip, and make haste, for it is growing late. This book, said the barber, opening another, is the 10 books of the Fortune of Love, written by Antonio di Lofraso, a Sardinian poet. By the orders I have received, said the curate, since Apollo has been Apollo, and the muses have been muses, and poets have been poets, so droll and absurd a book as this has never been written, and in its way it is the best and most singular of all this species that have yet appeared, and he who has not read it may be sure he has never read what is delightful. Give it here, gossip, for I make more account of having found it than if they had given me a cassock of Florence stuff. He put it aside with extreme satisfaction, and the barber went on, These that come next are the Shepherd of Iberia, Nymphs of Henares, and the Enlightenment of Jealousy. Then all we have to do, said the curate, is to hand them over to the secular arm of the housekeeper, and ask me not why, or we shall never have done. This next is the Pastor de Felida. No pastor that, said the curate, but a highly polished courtier. Let it be preserved as a precious jewel. This large one here, said the barber, is called the Treasury of Various Poems. If there were not so many of them, said the curate, they would be more relished. This book must be weeded and cleansed of certain vulgarities which it has with its excellences. Let it be preserved, because the author is a friend of mine, and out of respect for other more heroic and loftier works that he has written. This, continued the barber, is the Cancionero of Lopez de Maldonado. The author of that book, too, said the curate, is a great friend of mine, and his verses from his own mouth are the admiration of all who hear them, for such is the sweetness of his voice that he enchants when he chants them. It gives rather too much of its eclogues, but what is good was never yet plentiful, yet it be kept with those that have been set apart. But what book is next it? The Galatea of Miguel de Cervantes, said the barber. That Cervantes has been for many years a great friend of mine, and to my knowledge he has had more experience in reverses than in verses. His book has some good invention in it. It presents us with something, but brings us nothing in conclusion. We must wait for the second part it promises. Perhaps with amendment it may succeed in winning the full measure of grace that is now denied it. And in the meantime, do you, Signor Gossip, keep it shut up in your own quarters. Very good, said the barber, and here come 3 together. The Araucana of Don Alonso de Ercilla, the Austriada of Juan Rufo, Justice of Cordova, and the Montserrat of Cristobal de Virtues, the Valencian poet. These 3 books, said the curate, are the best that have been written in Castilian in heroic verse, and they may compare with the most famous of Italy. Let them be preserved as the richest treasures of poetry that Spain possesses. The curate was tired, and would not look into any more books, and so he decided that, contents uncertified, all the rest should be burned. but just then the barber held open one called the Tears of Angelica. I should have shed tears myself, said the curate when he heard the title, had I ordered that book to be burnt, for its author was one of the most famous poets of the world, not to say of Spain, and was very happy in the translation of some of Ovid's fables. Chapter 7. Of the second sally of our worthy knight Don Quixote of La Mancha. At this instant Don Quixote began shouting out, "Hear, hear, valiant knights, here is need for you to put forth the might of your strong arms, for they of the court are gaining the mastery in the tourney." Called away by this noise and outcry, they proceeded no farther with the scrutiny of the remaining books, and so it is thought that the Carolea, the Lion of Spain, and the Deeds of the Emperor, written by Don Luis de Avila, went to the fire unseen and unheard, for no doubt they were among those that remained, and perhaps if the curate had seen them they would have not undergone so severe a sentence. When they reached Don Quixote, he was already out of bed, and was still shouting and raving and slashing and cutting all round, as wide awake as if he had never slept. They closed with him, and by force got him back to bed, and when he had become a little calm, addressing the curate, he said to them, "Of a truth, Signor Archbishop Turpin, it is a great disgrace for us who call ourselves the 12 Peers so carelessly to allow the knights of the court to gain victory in this tourney, we the adventurers having carried off the honour on the 3 former days." "Hush, gossip," said the curate. "Please God, the luck may turn, and what is lost today may be won tomorrow. For the present, let your worship have a care of your health, for it seems to me that you are over-fatigued, if not badly wounded." "Wounded? No," said Don Quixote, "but bruised and battered, no doubt, for that bastard Don Roland has cudgelled me with the trunk of an oak tree, and all for envy, because he sees that I alone rival him in his achievements. But I should not call myself Reinaldos of Montalvan did he not pay me for it in spite of all his enchantments as soon as I rise from this bed. For the present, let them bring me something to eat, for that, I feel, is what will be more to my purpose, and leave it to me to avenge myself." They did as he wished. They gave him something to eat, and once more he fell asleep, leaving them marvelling at his madness. That night the housekeeper burned to ashes all the books that were in the yard and in the whole house, and some must have been consumed that deserved preservation in everlasting archives, but their fate and the laziness of the examiner did not permit it, and so in them was verified the proverb that the innocent suffer for the guilty. One of the remedies which the curate and the barber immediately applied to their friend's disorder was to wall up and plaster the room where the books were, so that when he got up he should not find them. Possibly the cause being removed, the effect might cease, and they might say that a magician had carried them off, room and all, and this was done with all despatch. 2 days later, Don Quixote got up, and the first thing he did was to go and look at his books, and not finding the room where he had left it, he wandered from side to side looking for it. He came to the place where the door used to be, and tried it with his hands, and turned and twisted his eyes in every direction without saying a word, but after a good while he asked his housekeeper whereabouts was the room that held his books. The housekeeper, who had already been well instructed in what she was to answer, said, "What room or what nothing is it that your worship is looking for? There are neither room nor books in this house now, for the devil himself has carried all away." "It was not the devil," said the niece, "but a magician who came on a cloud one night after the day your worship left this, and, dismounting from a serpent that he rode, he entered the room, and what he did there I know not, but after a little while he made off, flying through the roof, and left the house full of smoke, and when we went to see what he had done, we saw neither book nor room. But we remember very well, the housekeeper and I, that on leaving, the old villain said in a loud voice that for a private grudge he owned the owner of the books and the room, he had done mischief in that house that would be discovered by and by, and he said that his name was the sage Muniton." "He must have said Friston," said Don Quixote. "I don't know whether he called himself Friston or Freeton," said the housekeeper. "I only know that his name ended with ton." "So it does," said Don Quixote, and he is a sage magician, a great enemy of mine, who he has a spite against me because he knows by his arts and lore that in process of time I am to engage in single combat with a knight whom he befriends, and that I am to conquer, and that he will be unable to prevent it, and for this reason he endeavours to do me all the ill turns that he can. But I promise him it will be hard to oppose or avoid what is decreed by heaven." "Who doubts that?" said the niece. "But, uncle, who mixes you up in these quarrels? Would it not be better to remain at peace in your own house, instead of roaming the world looking for better bread than ever came of wheat, never reflecting that many go for wool and never come back shorn?" "O niece of mine," replied Don Quixote, "how much astray art thou in thy reckoning! Ere they shear me, I shall have plucked away and stripped off the beards of all those who dare to touch only the tip of a hair of mine." The two were unwilling to make any further answer, as they saw that his anger was kindling. In short, then, he remained at home 15 days very quietly, without showing any signs of a desire to take up his former delusions, and during this time he held lively discussions with his two gossips, the curate and the barber, on the point he maintained that knights-errant were what the world stood most in need of, and that in him was to be accomplished the revival of knight-errantry. The curate sometimes contradicted him, sometimes agreed with him, for if he had not observed this precaution, he would have been unable to bring him to reason. Meanwhile, Don Quixote worked upon a farm labourer, a neighbour of his, an honest man, if indeed that title can be given to him who is poor, but with very little wit in his pate. In a word, he so talked him over, and with such persuasions and promises, that the poor clown made up his mind to sally forth with him and serve him as an esquire. Don Quixote, among other things, told him he ought to be ready to go with him gladly, because any moment an adventure might occur that might win an island in the twinkling of an eye, and leave him governor of it. On these and the like promises, Sancho Panza, for so the labourer was called, left wife and children, and engaged himself as esquire to his neighbour. Don Quixote next set about getting some money, and selling one thing and pawning another, and making a bad bargain in every case, he got together a fair sum. He provided himself with a buckler, which he begged as a loan from a friend, and, restoring his battered helmet as best he could, he warned his squire Sancho of the day and hour he meant to set out, that he might provide himself with what he thought most needful. Above all, he charged him to take Alforas with him. The other said he would, and that he meant to take also a very good ass he had, as he was not much given to going on foot. About the ass, Don Quixote hesitated a little, trying whether he could call to mind any knight-errant taking with him an esquire mounted on ass-back, but no instance occurred to his memory. For all that, however, he determined to take him, intending to furnish him with a more honourable mount when a chance of it presented himself, by appropriating the horse of the first discourteous knight he encountered. Himself he provided with shirts and such other things as he could, according to the advice the host had given him, all which being done, without taking leave, Sancho Panza of his wife and children, or Don Quixote of his housekeeper and niece, they sallied forth, unseen by anybody from the village one night, and made such good way in the course of it that by daylight they held themselves safe from discovery, even should search be made for them. Sancho rode on his ass like a patriarch, with these alforjas and bota, and longing to see himself soon governor of the island his master had promised him. Don Quixote decided upon taking the same route and road he had taken on his first journey, that over the Campo de Montiel, which he travelled with less discomfort than on the last occasion, for as it was early morning and the rays of the sun fell on them obliquely, the heat did not distress them. "And now," said Sancho Panza to his master, "your worship will take care, Señor Knight-errant, not to forget about the island you have promised me, for it be ever so big I'll be equal to governing it." To which Don Quixote replied, "Thou must know, friend Sancho Panza, that it was a practice very much in vogue with the knights-errant of old to make their squires governors of the islands or kingdoms they won, and I am determined that there shall be no failure on my part in so liberal a custom. On the contrary, I mean to improve on it, for they sometimes, and perhaps most frequently, waited until their squires were old, and then, when they had had enough of service and hard days and worse nights, they gave them some title or other, of count, or at the most marquis, of some valley or province more or less. But if thou livest and I live, it may well be that before 6 days are over, I may have won some kingdom that has others dependent upon it, which will be just the thing to enable thee to be crowned king of one of them. Nor needest thou count this wonderful, for things and chances fall to the lot of such knights in ways so unexampled and unexpected that I might easily give thee even more than I promised thee. In that case, said Sancho Panza, if I should become a king by one of those miracles your worship speaks of, even Juana Gutierrez, my old woman, would come to be queen, and my children infantes. Well, who doubts it? Said Don Quixote. I doubt it, replied Sancho Panza, because for my part I am persuaded that though God should shower down kingdoms upon earth, not one of them would fit the head of Mari Gutierrez. Let me tell you, senor, she is not worth 2 maravedis for a queen. Countess will fit her better, and that only with God's help. Leave it to God, Sancho, returned Don Quixote, for he will give her what suits her best. But do not undervalue thyself so much as to come to be content with anything less than being governor of a province. I will not, senor, answered Sancho, specially as I have a man of such quality for a master in your worship, who will know how to give me all that will be suitable for me, and that I can bear. Chapter 8. Of the good fortune with the valiant Don Quixote had in the terrible and undreamt of adventure of the windmills, with other occurrences worthy to be fitly recorded. At this point, they came in sight of 30-40 windmills that there are on plain, and as soon as Don Quixote saw them, he said to his squire, Fortune is arranging matters for us better than we could have shaped our desires ourselves, for look thee, friend Sancho Panza, where 30 or more monstrous giants present themselves, all of whom I mean to engage in battle and slay, and with whose spoils we shall begin to make our fortunes, for this is righteous warfare, and it is God's good service to sweep so evil a breed from off the face of the earth. What giants? Said Sancho Panza. Those thou seest there, answered his master, with the long arms, and some of them are nearly 2 leagues long. Look, your worship, said Sancho, what we see there are not giants but windmills, and what seem to be their arms are the sails that, turned by the wind, make the millstone go. It is easy to see, replied Don Quixote, that thou art not used to the business of adventures. Those are giants, and if thou art afraid, away with thee out of this, and betake thyself to prayer, while I engage in them in fierce and unequal combat. So saying, he gave the spur to his steed Rocinante, heedless of the cries his squire Sancho sent after him, warning him that most certainly they were windmills, and not giants, he was going to attack. He, however, was so positive they were giants that he neither heard the cries of Sancho nor perceived, near as he was, what they were, but made at them, shouting, Fly not, cowards and vile beings, for a single knight attacks you. A slight breeze at this moment sprang up, and the great sails began to move, seeing which Don Quixote exclaimed, Though ye flourish more arms than the giant Briareus, ye have to reckon with me. So saying, and commending himself with all his heart to his lady Dulcinea, imploring her to support him in such peril, with lance in rest and covered by his buckler, he charged at Rocinante's fullest gallop, and fell upon the first mill that stood in front of him. But as he drove his lance point into the sail, the wind whirled it around with such force that it shivered the lance to pieces, sweeping with it horse and rider, who went rolling over on the plain in a sorry condition. Sancho hastened to his assistance as fast as his ass could go, and when he came up found him unable to move, with such a shock had Rocinante fallen with him. God bless me, said Sancho, did I not tell your worship to mind what you were about, for they were only windmills, and no one could have made any mistake about it but one who had something of the same kind in his head. Hush, Fred Sancho, replied Don Quixote, The fortunes of war, more than any other, are liable to frequent fluctuations, and moreover I think, and it is the truth, that that same sage Friston, who carried off my study and books, has turned these giants into mills, in order to rob me of the glory of vanquishing them, such is the enmity he bears me. But in the end his wicked arts will avail but little against my good sword." "God order it as he may," said Sancho Panza, and helping him to rise, got him up again on Rocinante, whose shoulder was half out, and then, discussing the late adventure, they followed the road to Puerto Lapice, for there, said Don Quixote, they could not fail to find adventures in abundance and variety, as it was a great thoroughfare. For all that, he was much grieved at the loss of his lance, and saying so to his squire, he added, "I remember having read how a Spanish knight, Diego Perez de Vargas by name, having broken his sword in battle, tore from an oak a ponderous bough or branch, and with it did such things that day, and pounded so many Moors, that he got the surname of Machucha, and he and his descendants from that day forth were called Vargas y Manchucha. I mention this because from the first oak I see, I meant to rend such another branch, large and stout like that, with which I am determined and resolved to do such deeds that thou mayest deem thyself very fortunate in being found worthy to come and see them, and be an eyewitness of things that will be with difficulty believed." "Be that as God will," said Sancho. "I believe it all as your worship says it, but straighten yourself a little, for you seem all on one side, may be from the shaking of the fall." "That is the truth," said Don Quixote, "and I make no complaint of the pain it is, because knights-errant are not permitted to complain of any wound, even though their bowels be coming out through it." "If so," said Sancho, "I have nothing to say, but God knows I would rather your worship complained when anything ailed you. For my part, I confess I must complain however small the ache may be, unless this rule about not complaining extends to the squires of knights-errant also." Don Quixote could not help laughing at his squire's simplicity, and he assured him he might complain whenever and however he chose, just as he liked, for so far he had never read of anything to the contrary in the order of knighthood. Sancho bade him remember it was dinner time, to which his master answered that he wanted nothing himself just then, but that he might eat when he had a mind. With this permission, Sancho settled him as comfortably as he could on his beast, and taking out of the alforjas which he had stowed away in them, he jogged along behind his master, munching deliberately, and from time to time taking a pull at the boter with a relish that the thirstiest tapster in Malaga might have envied. And while he went on this way, gulping down draught after draught, he never gave a thought to any of the promises his master had made him, nor did he rate it as hardship, but rather as recreation, going in quest of adventures, however dangerous they might be. Finally, they passed the night among some trees, from one of which Don Quixote plucked a dry branch to serve him after a fashion as a lance, and fixed it on the head he had removed from the broken one. All that night Don Quixote lay awake, thinking of his lady Dulcinea, in order to conform to what he had read in his books, how many a night in the forests and deserts knights used to lie sleepless, supported by the memory of their mistresses. Not so did Sancho Panza spend it, for having his stomach full of something stronger than chicory water, he made but one sleep of it, and if his master had not called him, neither the rays of the sun beating on his face, nor all the cheery notes of the birds welcoming the approach of day would have had the power to waken him. On getting up, he tried the boter, and found it somewhat less full than the night before, which grieved his heart, because they did not seem to be on the way to remedy the deficiency readily. Don Quixote did not care to break his fast, for, as has been already said, he confined himself to savoury recollections for nourishment. They returned to the road they had set out, leading to Puerto Lapice, and at 3 p.m. they came in sight of it. "Here, brother Sancho Panza," said Don Quixote when he saw it, "we may plunge our hands up to the elbows in what they call adventures. But observe, even shouldst thou see me in the greatest danger in the world, thou must not put a hand to thy sword in my defence, unless indeed thou perceivest that those who assail me are rabble or base folk, for in that case thou mayest very properly aid me. But if they be knights, it is on no account permitted or allowed thee by the laws of knighthood to help me until thou hast been dubbed a knight." "Most certainly, señor," replied Sancho, "your worship shall be fully obeyed in this matter, all the more as of myself I am peaceful, and no friend to mixing in strife and quarrels. It is true that as regards the defence of my own person, I shall not give much heed to those laws, for laws human and divine allow each one to defend themselves against any assailant whatever." "That I grant," said Don Quixote, "but in this matter of aiding me against knights, thou must put a restraint upon thy natural impetuosity." "I will do so, I promise you," answered Sancho, "and will keep this precept as carefully as Sunday." While they were thus talking, there appeared on the road 2 friars of the order of Saint Benedict, mounted on 2 dromedaries, for not less tall were the 2 mules they rode on. They wore travelling spectacles and carried sunshades, and behind them came a coach attended by 4 or 5 persons on horseback and 2 muleteers on foot. In the coach there was, as afterwards appeared, a Biscay lady on her way to Seville, where her husband was about to take passage for the Indies with an appointment of high honour. The friars, though going the same road, were not in her company, but the moment Don Quixote perceived them, he said to his squire, "Either I am mistaken, or this is going to be the most famous adventure that has ever been seen, for those black bodies we see there must be, and doubtless are, magicians who are carrying off some stolen princess in that coach, and with all my might I must undo this wrong." "This will be worse than the windmills," said Sancho. "Look, señor, those are friars of Saint Benedict, and the coach plainly belongs to some travellers. I tell you, mind well what you are about, and don't let the devil mislead you." "I have told thee already, Sancho," replied Don Quixote, "that on the subject of adventures thou knowest little. What I say is the truth, as thou shalt see presently." So saying, he advanced and posted himself in the middle of the road along which the friars were coming, and as soon as he thought they had come near enough to hear what he said, he cried aloud, "Devilish and unnatural beings, release instantly the high-born princesses whom you are carrying off by force in this coach, else prepare to meet a speedy death as just punishment of your evil deeds." The friars drew rein and stood wondering at the appearance of Don Quixote, as well as at his words, to which they replied, "Señor Caraballero, we are not devilish or unnatural, but 2 brothers of Saint Benedict following our road, nor do we know whether or not there are any captive princesses coming in this coach." "No soft words with me, for I know you, lying rabble," said Don Quixote, and without waiting for a reply, he spurred Rocinante, and with levelled lance charged the first friar with such fury and determination that if the friar had not flung himself off the mule, he would have brought him to ground against his will, and sore wounded, if not killed outright. The second brother, seeing how his comrade was treated, drove his heels into his castle of a mule and made off across the country faster than the wind. Sancho Panza, when he saw the friar on the ground, dismounting briskly from his ass, rushed towards him and began to strip off his gown. At that instant the friar's muleteers came up and asked what he was stripping him for. Sancho answered them that this fell to him lawfully as spoil of the battle which his lord Don Quixote had won. The muleteers, who had no idea of a joke and did not understand all this about battles and spoils, seeing that Don Quixote was some distance off talking to the travellers in the coach, fell upon Sancho, knocked him down, and leaving him hardly a hair on his beard, belaboured him with kicks and left him stretched breathless and senseless on the ground, and without any more delay helped the friar to mount, who, trembling, terrified, and pale, as soon as he found himself in the saddle, spurred after his companion, who was standing at a distance looking on, watching the result of the onslaught. Then, not caring to wait for the end of the affair just begun, they pursued their journey, making more crosses than if they had the devil after them. Don Quixote was, as has been said, speaking to the lady in the coach. "Your beauty, lady mine," said he, may now dispose of your person as may be most in accordance with your pleasure, for the pride of your ravishers lies prostrate on the ground through this strong arm of mine, and lest you should be pining to know the name of your deliverer, know that I am called Don Quixote of La Mancha, knight errant and adventurer, and captive to the peerless and beautiful lady Dulcinea del Toboso, and in return for the service you have received of me, I ask no more than you should return to El Toboso, and on my behalf present yourself before that lady, and tell her what I have done to set you free. One of the squires in attendance upon the coach, a Biscayan, was listening to all Don Quixote was saying, and perceiving that he would not allow the coach to go on, but was saying it must at once return to El Toboso, he made at him, and seizing his lance, addressed him in bad Castilian, and worse Biscayan after his fashion, Begone, caballero, and ill go with thee, by the God that made thee, unless thou quittest coach, slayest thee, as art here a Biscayan. Don Quixote understood him quite well, and answered him very quietly, If thou wert a knight, as thou art none, I should already chastise thy folly and rashness, miserable creature. To which the Biscayan returned, I no gentleman, I swear to God thou liest as am Christian. If thou droppest lance and drawest sword, soon shalt thou see thou art carrying water to the cat, Biscayan on land, Hidalgo at sea, Hidalgo at the devil, and look, if thou sayest otherwise, thou liest. You will see presently, said Agrajes, replied Don Quixote, and throwing his lance on the ground, he drew his sword, braced his buckler on his arm, and attacked the Biscayan, bent upon taking his life. The Biscayan, when he saw him coming on, though he wished to dismount from his mule, in which, being one of those sorry ones let out for hire, he had no confidence, had no choice but to draw his sword. It was lucky for him, however, that he was near the coach, from which he was able to snatch a cushion that served him for a shield, and they went at one another as if they had been two mortal enemies. The others strove to make peace between them, but could not, for the Biscayan had declared in his disjointed phrase that if they did not let him finish his battle, he would kill his mistress and everyone that strove to prevent him. The lady in the coach, amazed and terrified at what she saw, ordered the coachman to draw aside a little, and set herself to watch this severe struggle, in the course of which the Biscayan smote Don Quixote a mighty stroke on the shoulder over the top of his buckler, which, given to one without armour, would have cleft him to the waist. Don Quixote, feeling the weight of this prodigious blow, cried aloud, saying, O lady of my soul, Dulcinea, flower of beauty, come to the aid of this your knight, who, in fulfilling his obligations to your beauty, finds himself in extreme peril. To say this, to lift his sword, to shelter himself well behind his buckler, and to assail the Biscayan, was the work of an instant, determined as he was to venture all upon a single blow. The Biscayan, seeing him come on in this way, was convinced of his courage by his spirited bearing, and resolved to follow his example. So he waited for him, keeping well under cover of his cushion, being unable to execute any sort of maneuver with his mule, which, dead tired and never meant for this kind of game, could not stir a step. On then, as aforesaid, came Don Quixote against the weary Biscayan, with uplifted sword and a firm intention of splitting him in half, while on his side the Biscayan waited for him sword in hand, and under the protection of his cushion, and all present stood trembling, waiting in suspense the result of blows such as threatened to fall, and the lady in the coach and the rest of her following were making 1,000 vows and offerings to all the images and shrines of Spain, that God might deliver her squire and all of them from this great peril in which they found themselves. But it spoils all, that at this point and crisis the author of the history leaves this battle impending, giving as excuse that he could find nothing more written about these achievements of Don Quixote other than what has been already set forth. It is true, the second author of this work was unwilling to believe that a history so curious could have been allowed to fail under sentence of oblivion, or that the wits of La Mancha could have been so undiscerning as to not preserve in their archives or registries some documents referring to this famous knight. And this being his persuasion, he did not despair of finding the conclusion of this present history, which, heaven favouring him, he did find in a way that shall be related in the second part.